Yeah, it's chapter 4. And what I'm going to read is at the beginning, we meet a writer named Howard Spence, who's in the future in 2036. And there's been a war, and where the global government has been driven out, and they're picking up the pieces. Well, now you learn about a mysterious stranger that the new president has learned about, named Joshua Lance, and he needs to know who he is because he's found out he's got some problems, and this man knew some things that intrigued him. So he has to go talk to Howard Spence because he gets a letter telling him to do that. So now at this point, we're back in the present day where Howard Spence has first met this man. So he's starting to recount the story. So here it says, eventually the old man said, there will be no America. It will just be another subject state of a global government. Everything is international law this and greater good that. He bobbed his head sideways as he said this. In theory, all this sounds all right. He held up a hand. Everybody is taken care of. Everyone is equal. The big old fat utopia. He laid his head back inside. But, I offered. He laughed. I think you know how well this worked in practice. You see, Howard, you were the only one of us that could see what a disaster this global village would become. You had foresight. You always did. I'm sure I squirmed slightly. A crow landed on a limb above us and called out a few times before flying on. Lance sat and watched the crows sail above over the expanse. The sleek blackbird dived into the valley below as a hawk flew from the distance and dove in after him.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey.
Anyway, the America you know will be gone. He started to stare out across the mountainside. Even the greatly reduced freedom you've grown used to won't exist. There will be no president, just a North American governor who reports to a European government. So you're here to fix it, right? I asked. What do we do to prevent this? Nothing, he smiled sadly. But I said, I can write about your experiences, get you on TV, something. He laughed softly and shook his head. No, it's not that simple. But we have to. No, Howard. No one would believe us anyway. You're not even convinced fully of it yourself, are you? I looked down and pulled out my notebook. This was unbelievable, but there had to be an explanation, and I couldn't come up with a better one. You see, he said, there are a lot of Americans who think that this is a good thing. They don't want the responsibility of taking care of themselves. Sure, they rave all the time about how much they love freedom, but when they have the opportunity, his face took on a flustered look, they don't even want their own money or property. They would rather give it to the government and trust that they will get some back. No, my friend, they won't thirst for freedom before they drink from tyranny. So we're screwed? Is that why you're here, to deliver hopelessness? I stammered. Not exactly, he smiled. Let me tell you the story. I shrugged. There didn't seem to be many options, so I listened. Lance sat for a moment composing his thoughts, staring out across the peaceful mountainside. A lot of folks here think that I'm from somewhere else because no one knows me, he smiled. But I'm a North Carolina boy like you. I grew up in Alamance County, first place where the people took a stand and told the British to take their taxes and shove them. Of course, the British governor, Tryon, couldn't have this, so they killed a bunch of them and executed their leaders. That happened in a field beside Alamance Creek. They called it the Battle of Alamance. It wasn't much of a battle, more of a slaughter, really. But it did serve to show all the colonies just what they were dealing with. There would be no redress of grievances, no fair forum. Any complaints would fall on deaf ears, and death to those who refused to remember their place as subjects of the crown. The future leaders learned from this that if they laid it on the line, they had better be prepared to back it up with hot lead and cold steel. Well, a nice little history lesson, I said. What does that have to do with the future? The future is the same as the past. He leaned forward. It always is. That's the reason governments don't encourage their people to learn from their past. Well, enough of that. About me, I was born in 1980. I was the captain of the football team at Burlington Central High School. You're the oldest looking 21-year-old I've ever seen, I smirked. He laughed. I was 56 when I returned to this town. That was 4 years ago. Lance ran a hand through his thick salt and pepper hair. I guess in reality I would be about 60 now. I had to admit that he was in very good shape for a 60-year-old man. He was a good-sized man, just a little over 6 feet tall with a thick chest and broad shoulders. The mountain life kept him in good tone. Anyway, he continued, I was a really good football player. I was an all-state quarterback, he smiled. Several schools, including UNC, were offering me full scholarships. My future looked bright. Looked bright? I had caught the nuance, and he smiled that this hadn't slipped by unquestioned. Yes, looked. Well, Howard, our big Robin was Durham, and we had just beaten them. We were behind by 3, and it was 3rd down on our 4-yard line. I barely managed to scramble away from their linebacker in my own end zone, and there wide open was Larry Maddox. I sailed the ball right into his hands, and he was off. He outran the only defender. It was green grass and blue skies all the way. We won, 17-13. He smiled and put his hands behind his head. The memory seemed to relax him then. He smiled and the smile faded. He sighed and the smile faded. Well, we celebrated that night. There was a party at the Finch's cabin down at Lake McIntosh. A scowl crossed his face. Connor Finch was the backup quarterback. Quite a schmoozer. He could charm anybody, but very jealous of me. I was quite sleepy when I left the party, and I fell asleep driving home along some back roads beside the lake. Lance stood and walked over to the wood pile and picked up a stick of wood and tossed it back into the pile. He stood with his hands on his hips for a while. It almost seemed he would not continue, and then he came back and sat down again. I had a brand new Mustang. Boy, it was pretty. Sleek, royal blue. I had just polished it. Of course, I kept it that way. He scratched his chin, then shook his head. Oh yeah, anyway. It ran off the road and hit a culvert on the left side of the car. The floor area crumpled and crushed my left foot, and the car went into a spin. I knew I was in real trouble when I heard the splash. I had landed in a shallow inlet in the corner of the lake. He lowered his head and grunted. It was just deep enough to cover my car. Only the top of the roof was sticking out. I had left the passenger window slightly ajar to let some air flow in. Of course, it also let the water flow in rather quickly. I was able to release the seat belt and work my foot out from where the dash had collapsed on it, but he seemed to have trouble looking directly at me. The lines in his face deepened, old pain etched in his brow. Well, I couldn't get the door open, and the electric windows wouldn't work. My foot was too messed up to let me crawl to the other side, and I was in a panic. Water was up to my chin. I prayed out loud. He chuckled nervously. I never did that. Don't get me wrong, I was always a believer, but sorry to say, I never was the praying type, especially out loud. So it was like the Lord's Prayer, the 23rd Psalm, singing Jesus loves me, whatever I could think of until the water got too high. Then it was just sputtering, God help me, and Jesus saved me and such, and the end was upon me, and I was scared. His chest rose and fell. In his mind, the water was all about him, and he vainly searched for air. I remember the moon shining through the water about the front windshield. I would put my mouth up to the ceiling to get a breath of air and then settle back into the seat until the air was gone. I wasn't sure I could keep doing this much longer. My shoulders sagged a bit. Then I heard a loud bang on the roof above me. A voice cried out for me to hold on. So I pushed up on the seat in the console and pulled in another lungful of air and heard something hit my window. I looked over as it hit again. It looked like a metal tool of some kind. The water resistance was too great. He wasn't going to be able to break the window, and I couldn't hold out. As I began to sink back into the seat, he had turned the tool. I was later to learn it was a tire tool that came to a point on one end. Well, he turned it around and made a stabbing motion, and then the pointed end into the water, and it slammed into the window, shattering it. The last bubbles escaped my mouth when I felt the hands under my shoulders. Retelling seemed to tire him out. My own breathing had grown shallow, and now I relaxed a bit. The edge of the seat dug into my rear. The next thing I remember, I awoke on the side of the road. There was a young man about my age. The old man smiled. Sitting beside me, I could hear a siren in the distance. The boy was vaguely familiar, voice and face. He made a tapping motion and air with his finger. I had seen him, but I couldn't place him. That would change. That's quite a tale, I said. You were lucky. Luck had nothing to do with it. Well, I offered at least to have a happy ending. Ending? He pointed at me. This is just the beginning.